The sound of sobbing children pierced through the morning air as yellow bulldozers carved through the heart of Maple Ridge Community Park. 8-year-old Emma Martinez pressed her face against the chain-link fence, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the swing set, where she'd spent countless afternoons, disappear beneath the mechanical teeth of progress. "They're destroying everything," she whispered, her small hands gripping the cold metal, as if her touch could somehow stop the inevitable. Behind her, 37 other children from the Willowbrook subdivision stood in stunned silence. Their parents formed a protective semicircle, some recording the destruction on their phones, others simply staring in disbelief at what was unfolding before them. The playground that had been the centerpiece of their community for over 15 years was being systematically erased, one swing, one slide, one memory at a time. Margaret Whitfield, the newly elected president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association, stood at the edge of the demolition site, wearing a crisp navy blazer and a satisfied smile. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against her clipboard as she surveyed the destruction with the cold efficiency of a military general. "Progress requires sacrifice," she announced to no one in particular, though her voice carried far enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "This eyesore has been a liability for far too long." The transformation of this peaceful Saturday morning into a scene of community devastation had been months in the making, though most residents had only learned of the plan 3 days earlier. For the past 2 years, families had gathered here every weekend for impromptu barbecues, birthday parties, and the simple joy of watching their children play in a safe, welcoming environment. The playground had become more than just a collection of equipment. It was the beating heart of their neighborhood, where friendships were forged and memories were made. Sarah Chen, a mother of 2 young boys, had been one of the first to arrive that morning. She'd driven over to set up for what was supposed to be a celebration of her son's 10th birthday, only to find the orange cones and warning signs that signaled the end of an era. "This can't be legal," she muttered, pulling out her phone to call her husband. "They can't just destroy public property without proper notice." But Margaret had done her homework. Every form had been filed, every regulatory requirement met, every legal loophole exploited. The demolition permit hung laminated on the temporary fence, official and unforgiving. The document bore the signatures of city officials who had been wined and dined at expensive restaurants, their approval purchased with the promise of increased property values and expanded tax revenue from the proposed golf course. The morning sun cast long shadows across the destruction zone as more families arrived, drawn by frantic phone calls and urgent text messages. Parents who had planned to spend the day watching their children play were instead witnessing the systematic dismantling of their community's gathering place. The sound of metal being torn apart mixed with the diesel rumble of heavy machinery, creating a symphony of destruction that seemed to echo the breaking of something more fundamental than just playground equipment. Father Michael Rodriguez, the local parish priest who had blessed the playground's original dedication ceremony, stood among the crowd with his hands clasped behind his back. His weathered face bore the weight of witnessing too many injustices, but his eyes held the fire of someone who had not yet given up on the possibility of justice. "In all my years serving this community," he said quietly to Sarah Chen, "I've never seen anything quite this heartless." The first direct confrontation came when 10-year-old Marcus Thompson broke away from his mother's protective grip and ran toward the fence. His small voice rose above the mechanical din as he shouted, "Stop! You're breaking my favorite swing." The boy's desperate plea caught the attention of the bulldozer operator, who paused his work and looked toward Margaret for guidance. She responded with a dismissive wave of her hand and a sharp command, "Keep working. We have a schedule to maintain." Marcus's mother, Linda Thompson, a registered nurse who had worked double shifts to afford their modest home in the subdivision, felt something break inside her chest. She had sacrificed countless hours of sleep and personal time to give her children access to this very playground. And now she was watching it disappear to make room for a golf course that would serve only the wealthy board members of the HOA. "This is our children's space," she called out, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You have no right to take it away." Margaret turned toward the growing crowd of protesters with the practiced condescension of someone who had never doubted their own authority. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, I have every right. The Homeowners Association owns this land, and we've determined that a golf course will provide significantly more value to the community than a playground that serves only a handful of families." Her tone was clipped and efficient, as if she were reading from a prepared script. The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The handful of families she referenced represented nearly every household in the subdivision, while the proposed golf course would be restricted to HOA board members and their guests. The monthly dues that funded the association's operations had been doubled in the past year, ostensibly to cover infrastructure improvements. But it was becoming clear that those improvements were designed to benefit only the most affluent residents. Dr. Amanda Foster, a pediatrician who had recently moved to the area, stepped forward from the crowd. Her professional demeanor commanded attention as she addressed Margaret directly. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'd like to understand the process by which this decision was made. Were the residents given an opportunity to vote on this proposal?" Her question was measured and precise, the kind of inquiry that demanded a substantive response. Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "The HOA board has the authority to make decisions regarding community assets. We don't require resident approval for every operational decision." The legal technicality was accurate, but it revealed the fundamental disconnect between the board's interpretation of their authority and the community's understanding of their rights. The crowd began to murmur with growing agitation as the implications of Margaret's statement became clear. For years, residents had been told that their monthly HOA fees were investments in shared community resources, but it was becoming apparent that shared was a relative term. The golf course represented the privatization of public space, a transformation that would exclude the very families who had funded its creation. As the morning wore on, the circle of protesters grew larger and more organized. Parents began arriving with homemade signs, their children clutching handwritten letters addressed to the mayor and city council members. The impromptu demonstration took on the characteristics of a movement, with residents who had never participated in community activism finding themselves on the front lines of a battle for their neighborhood's soul. Elena Vasquez, a high school history teacher who lived 3 blocks away, arrived with a group of her students who had volunteered to help with the protest. They carried clipboards and were systematically documenting the destruction, creating a visual record of what was being lost. "This is how democracy dies," she explained to her students, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had studied the erosion of civic institutions. Not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet consolidation of power by those who believe they know better than the people they serve. The bulldozers continued their methodical work, but their operators were clearly becoming uncomfortable with the growing crowd of protesters. Several had stopped their machines and were engaged in hushed conversations with Margaret and the site supervisor. The presence of children, in particular, seemed to be weighing on the workers, who had likely not anticipated the emotional intensity of the situation when they accepted the job. Margaret pulled out her phone and made a call that would escalate the situation beyond anything the protesters had expected. Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived, followed by a van from the private security company that the HOA had contracted to provide enhanced community safety services. The officers who emerged from the vehicles were not the familiar faces of the local police force, but representatives of a company that specialized in what they euphemistically called crowd management. The arrival of security personnel transformed the atmosphere from one of peaceful protest to something far more threatening. Children who had been playing at the edges of the demonstration suddenly found themselves face to face with uniformed officers carrying equipment that seemed designed more for riot control than community service. Parents instinctively moved their children behind them, creating a human barrier between the authorities and the next generation. Captain James Morrison, the lead security officer, approached Margaret with the efficient professionalism of someone who had handled similar situations many times before. His conversation with the HOA president was brief and conducted in low tones, but the outcome was predictable. Within minutes, he was addressing the crowd through a portable speaker system, his voice carrying the authority of official sanction. Ladies and gentlemen, you are currently trespassing on private property. The Willowbrook Homeowners Association has the legal right to modify this space as they see fit. You have 15 minutes to disperse before we begin issuing citations for unlawful assembly. The announcement was delivered with the mechanical precision of someone who had made similar statements countless times before. The threat of legal action created a moment of uncertainty among the protesters. Many were working parents who could not afford the financial burden of citations or legal fees, and the prospect of arrest was particularly concerning for those who worked in professions that required clean criminal records. But the sight of their children's playground being destroyed had awakened something deeper than fear, a sense of righteousness that could not be easily intimidated. Father Rodriguez stepped forward, his clerical collar catching the morning light as he addressed the security captain. "Officer Morrison, I'm curious about the legal basis for your threat. These are residents of the community, standing on property that they help maintain through their monthly fees. On what grounds are you claiming they are trespassing?" His question was delivered with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades advocating for justice. The captain's response revealed the legal complexity of the situation. "Father, the Homeowners Association has the right to restrict access to community property when necessary for construction or maintenance activities. These residents have been provided with proper notice and have had the opportunity to review the construction plans." The answer was technically correct, but morally hollow, highlighting the way that legal technicalities could be used to circumvent the spirit of community ownership. Sarah Chen, who had been quietly filming the interaction, stepped forward with her phone still recording. "Captain Morrison, could you please explain to our children why their playground is being destroyed to build a golf course that they will never be allowed to use?" Her question was directed not just at the security officer, but at the growing number of people who had begun streaming the confrontation on social media. The power of social media became apparent as the live stream attracted viewers from across the city and beyond. Comments began flooding in from people who were outraged by what they were seeing, and the hashtag #JuckSaveMapleRidge began trending locally. The protest was evolving from a local neighborhood dispute into a broader symbol of community resistance against corporate overreach. Margaret, sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond her control, decided to escalate her response. She approached the security captain and requested that he begin the process of issuing citations to the protesters. "These people need to understand that their emotional attachments don't override legal property rights," she declared, her voice carrying clearly across the demonstration area. The first citation was issued to Dr. Foster, who had been documenting the destruction for a potential legal challenge. As the officer handed her the ticket, she maintained her professional composure, but spoke loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "I want everyone to understand that this citation is being issued to a pediatrician who was standing peacefully on community property. advocating for children's access to recreational facilities. The issuance of citations created a domino effect among the protesters. Rather than dispersing, more residents began stepping forward, volunteering to receive their own tickets in a display of civil disobedience that caught the security team off guard. The children, seeing their parents' courage, began chanting, "Save our playground," in voices that carried across the entire neighborhood. The situation reached a turning point when Emma Martinez, the 8-year-old who had been crying at the fence, walked up to Margaret and looked directly into her eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield, my mom says you have children too. Would you be sad if someone took away their favorite place to play?" The question was delivered with the devastating honesty that only children can muster, and it seemed to penetrate Margaret's armor of professional detachment. For a moment, Margaret's composure cracked. Her own children were grown and had moved away years ago, but the memory of their childhood laughter seemed to flicker across her face. However, the vulnerability was quickly replaced by a hardened resolve. "Emma, dear, sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions for the good of the whole community. You'll understand when you're older." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and it served to further galvanize the protesters. The crowd's anger was reaching a boiling point when an unexpected figure arrived on the scene. Rebecca Martinez, Emma's mother and an investigative journalist for the local newspaper, had been conducting research into the HOA's financial practices for a story she was preparing. What she had discovered would change everything, but she needed to time her revelation carefully to maximize its impact. Rebecca approached the security perimeter with the confidence of someone who held powerful information. She addressed Margaret directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years uncovering corruption and holding public officials accountable. "Mrs. Whitfield, I think it's time for you to explain to these residents exactly who will be benefiting from this golf course project." Margaret's face went pale as she recognized the implications of Rebecca's presence. As an investigative journalist, Rebecca had access to public records and the skills to interpret complex financial documents. The fact that she was asking pointed questions suggested that she had uncovered information that the HOA board had hoped to keep private. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mrs. Martinez, but all of our financial records are available for review by any homeowner who submits a proper request." Margaret's response was technically accurate, but it ignored the fact that the HOA had made the process of accessing records as difficult and intimidating as possible. Rebecca smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had done her homework thoroughly. "Actually, Mrs. Whitfield, I've already reviewed those records. What I found was quite interesting. It appears that the construction contract for this golf course has been awarded to Whitfield Construction, a company owned by your husband. The cost of the project has been estimated at $1.2 million, which will be funded through a special assessment on all homeowners in the subdivision." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Not only was their playground being destroyed, but they were being forced to pay for its replacement with a facility that would exclude them. Furthermore, the contract had been awarded to a company owned by the HOA president's family, creating a clear conflict of interest that violated every principle of ethical governance. The murmur of the crowd grew into a roar of outrage as the implications of Rebecca's revelation became clear. Parents who had been struggling to understand how their elected representatives could be so callous toward their children's needs now understood that the decision had been motivated by personal financial gain rather than any concern for community welfare. Dr. Foster, who had been taking notes throughout the morning, stepped forward with her citation still in hand. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you telling us that the residents of this subdivision are being assessed $1.2 million to build a golf course that will be managed by your husband's construction company and used exclusively by HOA board members. Her question was delivered with the precision of a medical diagnosis, laying bare the symptoms of a deeply diseased system. Margaret's response was to turn and walk away. But Rebecca was not finished. "Mrs. Whitfield, I also discovered that the city permits for this project were approved after several city council members received donations to their campaign funds from companies associated with Whitfield Construction. Would you care to comment on that?" The question hung in the air, like an accusation, and Margaret's refusal to respond spoke volumes about its accuracy. The security captain, realizing that the situation had evolved beyond his ability to manage, approached Margaret for guidance. The presence of a journalist who was clearly prepared to expose corruption had transformed the demonstration from a simple trespassing issue into a potential scandal that could attract unwanted attention from higher authorities. Captain Morrison made the decision to suspend the citation process and withdraw his officers to a safer distance. The threat of legal action had lost its power once the protesters realized that the entire system was corrupted, and that their opposition was not just justified, but necessary. The children's playground had become a symbol of something much larger, the right of ordinary citizens to have a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. As news of the corruption spread through social media and local news outlets, the demonstration began attracting supporters from across the city. Other neighborhoods that had experienced similar situations with their own HOAs began sending representatives, and the protest evolved into a broader movement for reform of homeowner association governance. The bulldozers had stopped their work, their operators unwilling to continue destroying the playground while being filmed by dozens of cameras. The site supervisor, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, had called his company's headquarters to report the developing situation and request guidance on how to proceed. Margaret, realizing that her carefully constructed plan was falling apart, made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. She approached the crowd with a megaphone and began speaking in the tone of someone who believed that authority alone could overcome the power of truth. "I understand that some of you are upset, but this project has been approved through proper channels and will proceed as planned. Those who continue to interfere with lawful construction activities will face the full consequences of their actions." The threat rang hollow in the face of what the community had learned about the corruption that had enabled the project. Rebecca Martinez stepped forward with a stack of documents that she had prepared for her investigation. "Mrs. Whitfield, I have here copies of emails between your husband's company and several city officials discussing the approval process for this project. I also have financial records showing payments made to those same officials shortly before the permits were approved. Are you sure you want to continue with this charade?" The impact of Rebecca's evidence was immediate and devastating. The security officers began backing away from the site, unwilling to be associated with what was clearly becoming a major scandal. The construction workers shut down their equipment and began gathering their tools, recognizing that the project was likely to be suspended pending investigation. Margaret's final act of defiance was to declare that the HOA board would meet in emergency session to address the situation. But her words were drowned out by the cheers of the crowd. The children, who had been watching the adult drama unfold with wide eyes, began running toward the partially destroyed playground, reclaiming their space with the joy that only children can express. Within hours, the story had spread beyond the local community and attracted national attention. The image of children crying as their playground was destroyed to build a golf course for wealthy HOA board members became a powerful symbol of inequality and corruption. News crews from major networks arrived to cover the story, and the hashtag #JoshSaveMapleRidge was trending nationally. The pressure from media coverage and public outrage forced city officials to suspend all permits related to the golf course project pending a full investigation. The state attorney general's office announced that they would be reviewing the financial practices of the Willowbrook HOA and examining whether criminal charges were warranted. Margaret Whitfield's resignation came 3 days later, delivered in a brief statement that admitted no wrongdoing, but cited personal reasons for her decision to step down. Her husband's construction company lost several other contracts as news of the scandal spread, and the couple eventually moved out of the subdivision under cover of darkness. The playground was rebuilt using funds that had been earmarked for the golf course project, but the new design incorporated suggestions from the children who would use it. Emma Martinez, who had become something of a celebrity after her confrontation with Margaret, was invited to cut the ribbon at the dedication ceremony 6 months later. The broader impact of the Maple Ridge Playground controversy extended far beyond the Willowbrook subdivision. Legislation was introduced in the state legislature to increase transparency requirements for homeowner associations and create stronger oversight mechanisms. The case became a textbook example of how grassroots organizing and investigative journalism could combine to challenge corruption and defend community interests. Rebecca Martinez won a regional journalism award for her investigation, and her series of articles about HOA corruption was picked up by newspapers across the country. The story served as a reminder that democracy functions best when ordinary citizens are willing to stand up and demand accountability from their elected representatives. Father Rodriguez, reflecting on the events months later, observed that the playground controversy had strengthened the community in ways that no one had anticipated. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind us of what we value most, he said during a Sunday sermon. In this case, it wasn't just about saving a playground. It was about reclaiming our right to have a voice in the decisions that shape our lives. The new playground opened on a sunny Saturday morning in spring, with the same families who had protested its destruction gathering to celebrate its rebirth. Children who had watched their favorite swings disappear beneath the bulldozers were now playing on equipment that was newer, safer, and more inclusive than what had been destroyed. The sound of their laughter carried across the neighborhood like a promise that justice, however delayed, could still prevail. Emma Martinez, now 9 years old and somewhat wiser about the ways of the world, stood at the fence where she had once cried and watched the destruction of her favorite place. This time, her tears were tears of joy, and her small hands gripped the same metal links, not in desperation, but in celebration. The playground had been saved. But more importantly, the community had learned that their voices mattered, and that standing together could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. The story of the Maple Ridge Playground became a legend in the neighborhood, passed down to new families who moved into the subdivision. It served as a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would abuse their power for personal gain. The children who had participated in the protest grew up with a deep understanding of civic responsibility and the knowledge that their actions could make a difference in the world. Years later, when developers and corrupt officials threatened other communities, they would find themselves facing opponents who had learned from the Maple Ridge example. The playground had become more than just a place for children to play. It had become a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept injustice and fought for what they believed was right.